Barbara.
Okay, should I start?
Yes, we're live.
Okay, right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our event. Thank you all for coming. I'm Barbara Cleary, Chair of SecurityWomen, and you can read my bio on the platform. And Juliet Coleman, who you will see on the screen there, is the founder and director of SecurityWomen. My colleagues here today from Women in International Security are Min and Maxine, who will introduce themselves in a moment and tell you about WIIS. Together, we are hosting this event, and we have a fabulous panel of experts who have joined us today to share their learning and experience. This year at CSW, we're focused on innovation, technological change, and education in the digital age. First, a little bit about SecurityWomen. We're an international advocacy and research organization. The security world is predominantly 90% male. Our aim is to get more women into security institutions, including the military, police, and cybersecurity throughout the world. Localized crime, organized conflict, and cybersecurity throughout affects us all. Human security cannot be run along gender segregation lines. Women should be equal partners in the protection and security of citizens, particularly women, and proactive participants in matters of conflict resolution and peace building. Taking a lead from the business world, a more diverse workforce, in particular at decision-making levels, ensures broader thinking and leads to better results. The evidence shows that in societies where there is greater gender equality, there is less likelihood of conflict, and violence and peace agreements last longer. Digitalization is happening across all sectors and is the foundation of how we build the future. It is widely reported that by 2050, 75% of jobs will be related to STEM areas, and women remain sadly underrepresented. Just 22% of positions in artificial intelligence are held by women. In the 20 largest global tech companies in the world today, women comprise just 30% of the workforce. Turning to cybersecurity, a fast-moving, growing field that is changing how we do things more than ever before. But according to a recent Women in Workplace report from McKinsey & Company, women make up just 24% of the total workforce and occupy only 11% of the C-level positions. 249 million fewer women have access to the internet than men, even though they account for nearly half the world's population. Technology is part of every aspect of our daily lives, including security, personal security, national security, and international security, and security in space. Technology is integral to the delivery of security services, CCTV, access control systems and alarms, as well as integrated IT management systems which support the security operation of companies and keep them safe and their people safe. Technology and innovation are game changers and offer a huge potential for the future of our world. If used wisely, they are critical to finding solutions to climate, health, and medicine. We know that as technology expands, so do the threats and the vulnerabilities. We need to address and avoid potential harms with energy and tenacity. Women and girls bring a unique perspective to the fields of science and technology and innovation. Harnessing their skills and perspectives will enable us to develop more creative solutions in response to the challenges we face. A more balanced workforce naturally brings a greater variety of perspectives and is better equipped to handle a variety of problems. Closing the digital gap isn't just the right and wrong, it's good for business and good for security. In this session, we are going to take a deeper dive into women's influence in cybersecurity, innovation, and emerging technologies. We will explore the barriers women and girls face engaging in the world of technology across the sectors and how the gender playing field can be leveled. We need to fix the harmful stereotyping surrounding technology, innovation, and education that fail women and girls. We must give women and girls equal access to digital opportunities and a seat at the digital table. Together, we aim to come up with solutions that in time, we hope, will dramatically change the representation of women in a wide variety of roles. Sadly, Sarah, who was due to be with us today, has become ill with COVID, and we wish her well, and we miss her today. Min has stepped in and is going to lead our conversation and will introduce you to our speakers shortly. We have allowed plenty of time for questions and answers. You can either put your question in the chat or you can raise your hand by using the hand key function at the bottom of the screen, raise hand function. Please introduce yourself and say where you are from when asking your question or making a comment. I would also ask you all to keep your comments brief so that we can give as much airtime to everyone. We will do our very best to answer as many questions as possible. Just to let you know, we are recording this event. And if you're on social media, you will see on the screen our hashtag SecurityWomen CSW67 or hashtag WIIS CSW67. So over to you, Maxine.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Maxine Layton, and I'm delighted to be here with my esteemed colleagues, and thank you all who are joining us today. As the president of WIIS New York, my focus as part of the global organization is to focus on gender, migration, security, and climate change. And my role is to bridge what WIIS is so brilliantly doing globally in their vision and their acumen and their leadership, is to bridge gender, migration, security, and climate change with the built environment so that we can truly begin to manifest sustainable cities that are in keeping not just with the environmental changes in the natural world, but also to be able to take into account some of the most prevailing and most active issues of our time, which really have to do with gender, migration, and security, and how that bridges with climate change and some of those challenges that we are facing on a local, national, and global region perspective. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague and friend, Min.
Let me mute myself. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Barbara and Maxine, for participating and joining and putting this together. My name is Min Kirianis. I currently sit on the board for Women International Security, which is pronounced WIIS, as well as the CEO and founder of Amina Systems, a tech company. First off, I really want to thank everyone for being here and being huge advocates and allies, and for these discussions, and obviously pushing it forward constantly to talk about diversity within the workforce, which is really important. I also want to thank Julia Coleman, who was unable to join this call, for actually helping put this together. Women in International Security is the premier global organization dedicated to women's leadership and achieving gender equality in international peace and security. WIIS provides professional development, training, programming, research, and analysis to close the gender and diversity gap in the international security sector in all fields touching on security. For 35 years, we have built a body of evidence that women's leadership and gender empowerment are vital to overcoming critical global security challenges. Which leads us to today. We are honored to be here, and as advocates and practitioners in the cybersecurity and emerging technology space, we see the importance of diversity and inclusivity in the workplace or first for the business to excel. So let's get started on the bridge to the future. Women and girls at the center of progress, cybersecurity, and emerging technology. And apologies, I cannot talk today because I'm losing my voice. And here are our speakers, Dr. Robert Zuber. Wave your hand, Bob. He's the director of the UN-based Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict for over 3 decades. He's working in foreign policy, delving deeply into these topics. He has worked with governments and organizations alike to create a sustainable framework to address these complex issues, not only in developed countries, but to also find solutions for these developing nations that may be challenged in addressing gender and diversity parity in the modern workforce. Next, Kat Fan. Kat, please wave. Is a diversity and talent leader at the Women International Security. She's an indie author and advisor for the Tech Steering Committee for WIIS. She has a passion for empowering undeserved communities through advocacy, technology, and education. Lastly, John Doskarakis. He's an engineer and technology leader with over 25 years of experience contributing to and leading innovation initiatives in global organizations. His experience spans many verticals, including startups, aerospace, and industrial manufacturing. He's a builder of diverse worldwide advanced teams and a mentor who is active within his community, academia, trade organizations, and currently serves on an array of industry committee and boards. And with that, thank you very much for participating. And obviously a shout out to Sarah, who couldn't be here because of COVID. Let's get started. Lady and gentlemen, if you don't mind introducing yourself as we begin with a statement and question, that would be wonderful. So we know that the number of jobs in the technology world are set to grow by 315,000 and in cybersecurity and security by 245,000 in the next year. Most of these jobs are technical and need the ones educated in the field. But the number of women enrolled in STREAM, which is science, technology, robotics, engineering, architecture, and math, globally continues to decline. In fact, nearly 50% of women who enroll in STREAM leave these programs before they graduate. Given these, how can we expect to close the gender gap, and what should we do to address this? And with that, Bob, Kat, and John, if you don't mind unmuting your microphones, I'm gonna let you guys start chiming in, and please do introduce yourself in the beginning. John, I'll put you in a hot seat.
Well, thank you, man. I think you already did a good job of introducing us. I can only speak for me, but I am John Descarakis. And so I guess I'll just start by speaking to the specific statement you made related to education and entering the workforce. And, you know, speaking as somebody who is running a cybersecurity organization these days, in years past, I was a software engineer and I worked in, system and technology development. I don't as much today put so much weight on education as folks are entering the workforce in terms of what is your degree. The traditional focus of looking at applicants who are coming out of college has always been, and this is a cultural thing, not just in the United States, but I feel globally. We're always looking at sort of the quantitative over qualitative. What are the metrics by which we're going to hire folks? Do they have this degree? Which are the best universities that they're coming out of? Are they the right degrees? But cyber, in specifically the world where I operate today, this is a new science. And things change all the time. And folks that enter, or apply to roles that I have with 5, 10, 15, 20 years of experience and have all the right degrees aren't always the right candidates. We've started to shift our focus more to the qualitative because it's more, for me, about core skills. There's a giant employment gap in the workforce in terms of cyber skill sets. So I think traditionally folks were looking at a subset of the population as being the qualified applicants as the starting point. And that's always been a mistake. And that has created false barriers for many underrepresented, folks inside of my skill domain areas, cyber, software engineering, and diverse candidates sometimes are blocked out of it when you're only focused on these sort of quantitative metrics. Do they have the right degree? Did they go to the right school? So I think what's required and what's better for business, as a matter of fact, is focus on the qualitative, the core skills. Is someone capable of doing the work? Because you're going to learn on the job anyway. Very few enter the workforce right out of school ready to go. So that's been my approach for a while, and it's worked out and it's helped us close an employment gap, but it also better serves underrepresented groups such as women in the workforce.
That's great. And so, Kat, I'm going to jump to you because you do a lot of technical hiring at one point in a big tech firm. What do you think about all this?
There is a trend too in a lot of the tech companies, from startup to mid-size and large scale, looking at potential candidates that necessarily don't need to have that traditional background of a computer science degree. We are finding that folks with boot camp background or may have grown technologically strong will have the basic foundation to be able to be strong technically. And that had brought in and opened doors for a lot of people. Here in like the Bay Area, we are seeing a higher level of potential candidates that do very well joining the company with like a tech bootcamp background, and they just go through the program for about 6 weeks and then graduate through. And typically, kind of to what John had spoken to, it's like, it doesn't necessarily mean they have 5 to 10 years. It could just even be 2 to 3 years. And it's just more of that foundational acumen knowledge, because a lot of times with large scale companies, we don't expect people to be able to code or work at such a large scale. And so it's more of the thought process. So I also agree with like moving this trend to also allow for a wider opening of potential candidates in the pool.
Which is good. Bob, I know you have an extensive background, working on policies, and John and Kat are based in the US. And given that knowledge, a lot of the things that you're talking about is much more progressive than what you're accustomed to seeing from, other countries that may not necessarily have access to this. What do you think about that? And in terms of the numbers and how we can move forward?
Well, first of all, I love the fact that John and Kat, I'm not surprised by either of them, but I love the fact that they are willing to reinvest in the criteria for placement. It's absolutely key to diversity that we constantly kind of rethink criteria and rethink how flexible or inflexible they are, how much they are responding or not responding to these externals that most people don't have any control over, such as the prestige of your degree, which gets you into doors, but in some cases, but doesn't explain necessarily what you do once you get in the doors. I have a bit of a different perspective, I suppose. When I was at Georgia Tech last weekend talking to business and engineering students, and they basically accepted the fact that, and CSW certainly has promulgated this as well, that there are basically 3 different portals. One is the portal of development, like who develops technology and how you gain access to the institutional structures, the businesses, et cetera, that are producing this extraordinary array of technological innovations. The second has to do with like who gets to regulate, and regulation is very tricky. I remember listening to a radio program recently where the moderator was asking an AI specialist about regulation, and there was silence on the radio for a minute, and then there was this burst of laughter, and the guy said, I think that horse has long left the barn. And my sense is that the horse has not only left the barn, but it's galloping at such a speed that it's not clear whether or not any of us can rein it in at this point. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a huge issue for regulators because, like, for instance, at the UN, we have a very gender diverse group of people who are working on regulation of the tech sector. But what they're regulating is questions of access, right? Which is, I suppose, is important. It certainly is important. And questions of malicious use, which is, how do you impose human rights standards on a process that is being used more and more to make people's lives miserable? So that's all gender balanced. But the question is whether or not any of that matters, because at the UN we tend to regulate things that have already sort of run off and hidden, and we don't know where to find them, but we know how to regulate what they were doing before they ran off. We're very good at that. So this is the second issue, and then I think the third issue has to do with who ensures access and what kinds of access, and what role does education play in this. And I think that the problem that the students that I was talking to at Georgia Tech, and some of the people at CSW, certainly a lot of people at CSW, that they are concerned with not so much how to ensure access, but what kind of access to ensure, and how do we ensure that access is relevant to context? And many of those contexts are women-led communities in different parts of the world where certain kinds of innovation can make their lives more easier, more productive, more engaged, more connected. But other kinds of technology can make their lives more complicated, more miserable, create local hierarchies in addition to national and international hierarchies. And these are things that we don't want. So and having more women in all of these levels, the development side, which John and Kat are particularly adept at, the regulation side, which I'm particularly adept at, although I'm not sure it does any good, and the issue of access and what kinds of access and how to ensure that people who are community leaders, not necessarily national or international leaders, but community leaders, many of whom are women, have what they need to make their communities function more effectively and become happier and more robust places.
No.
So that's my take on the different gender lenses that I think we need to be conscious of.
And I think that it's very fascinating, right? Seeing it from the other side, and getting that perspective. I'm going to jump over to Kat based on what Bob had just stated. The gender barriers, the community leaders. I know you were activist in a big empowerment, especially growing up as an immigrant as well. What do you think Bob has done, especially now that you've worked in, the tech force? And John, I'm gonna put you on a hot seat too. So you're gonna have to chime in on that, being on the corporate side, what you feel about everything that Bob said. What can we do to help provide access on that scale in order to gain and garner, the community, and provide them the access that they need to move forward and get the help they need?
I mean, I think like in terms of a lot of the access, it's just like educating and bringing awareness and exposure. In the inner city youth, like where I worked in San Francisco in building out a lot of programs, we found that like there is a desire from the younger generation to recent college graduates to really like dip into the advocacy and technology space and integrating the two, because there is a lot of the generation really wants to bring on change and see a difference in the world. And so what I've been seeing and noticing too is that like, meanwhile, at other developing countries and areas are still working on having access to internet and whatnot, but the inner city side have their own different types of challenges too, which is like on the crime poverty side to access and just to devices and internet as well, and just staying off the streets. And so similar to what Bob was talking about, is like exposing people at a younger age and providing access to it. You're going to get more of a, I guess, like more momentum of a community looking into leveraging technology. And I just like push it over to John and see if you want anything to add.
Yeah, John, coming from the corporate sector, right? I know companies are always active in fostering young minds and talents. What do you feel is needed in order to help regulators and also catch up to, in a sense, right? Because I feel like Bob is saying the regulators are very, very far behind and they can't catch up. But what can be done by corporate partnerships like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I was thinking about some of the stuff Bob was saying. As he was saying, it's a lot to unpack as usual. Bob's a really smart person. But I think if you pick up on his tone, he seems to, uncertain that a lot of this regulation is really effective. I'll tell you that sometimes it is, sometimes it's a complete miss. I think what's required from big corporations is more partnership, and also taking the initiative upon themselves, right? So corporate leaders need to sometimes go and do on their own and not wait for regulations. And the best corporate executives are doing that already, right? So, long ago, I was encouraged by my leadership when I was still a young engineer, to get out into my community and volunteer with great and organizations like First Robotics, and try to, that is an avenue of access for young minds. So when we talk about access and we talk about context, as Bob mentioned, for me and for anyone that's leading initiatives in emerging fields of science, where you don't really have people that truly have 20 years or 15 years of experience, or they may have a degree that seems like would qualify them for a role in that emerging field. But the reality is, and this is why I've shifted more to qualitative over quantitative skills, I look for core skills and abilities, right, rather than metrics that are measurable. When you grant access to folks when they're young, or at any age really, where they can actually learn things and develop interest, that's the thing that's really going to turn them into a scientist, is going to, so the access to the fields like mine, you don't need to go to a university to learn cybersecurity, for example. But you do need a certain element of intellectual curiosity. And sometimes the partnership from industry with the community can really foster that, because it requires funding, and it requires people like myself and my colleagues take the time to get out there and work with the community and teach the things we know and mentor. Without that, you end up with, a lot of goodwill and no action.
Which is true. So let me ask this question. So what are the typical barriers? You talked about, the mindset and how you're becoming more qualitative, not quantitative. What are the typical barriers that women see, or girls who are interested in this see, to get in this kind of technology or cybersecurity field? Like, what's the mindset, the gender bias? Like, why is it that they're not interested, or, the percentage is not that high?
So as an employer, there are traditional barriers to entry, right? And you and I have talked about this before.
Yes, you and I talked about it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, employers will put up a job rec and they'll say, well, gee, this is a senior position and I need somebody with 10, 15 years of experience and this degree and that degree. The fact of the matter is, when I went to engineering school, I had very few female colleagues in my class, because for many reasons they chose not to go into engineering at that time. Probably because, and this is what friends of mine would tell me, it looked like a boys' club. So, years ago, that was one of those barriers to entry, just in the college ranks. So if I, as an employer now, 15, 20 years later, am only looking at candidates that have that engineering degree plus all this specific experience, when it's very much a male-dominated field, I would be carving out a big piece of the population that actually would probably be very good at the work, because again, it's an emerging technology. These barriers are really kind of biases that don't need to be there. So when you shift from these quantitative metrics where you're saying must have these things that I know a big part of the population isn't going to have, and I don't think people always think that way. They're not putting up, it's just a cultural way of doing things where we say, hey, well, we've always for 50 or 100 years hired people based on having these degrees and a certain number of years of experience. With emerging sciences, it's totally unnecessary, because most of what your candidate is going to end up doing, they will learn on the job. So it's far better to focus on core skills, intellectual curiosity. Are they capable of learning these things that we're going to teach them? Because most of the time, for most of my candidates, it takes them 6 to 12 months, no matter what their background and experience is, to really start to contribute to the team, because things that we're doing are not usual and not taught in books. So when we put up these false barriers, they're really, barriers to entry for a big part of the population. And as an employer, you're limiting your capacity to hire people. So to me, it's just bad business, and it's really morally also the wrong way to do things.
So that's an operator from the HR perspective when you're hiring CAT. I mean, what John says resonates a lot. I was one of a handful, I can count on one hand, of computer science programmers back in college days, and that's a long time ago. But when you're hiring and looking at resumes and, really passing the buck and trying to weed out the truth, the unicorn within a pile, what do you see?
What I'm seeing is like, there's a lot of women that I've spoke to that go through the interview process at different tech companies. And one of the biggest pieces is like, okay, do I want to join a company that is maybe their management is predominantly male dominated? Do I want to be a part of that fraternity type of culture? Some more senior women would be as savvy as to like, look at, okay, teams that I would join, would there be similar folks that resembles me within that? Or I guess it's more of how much of like this siloed effect of like women going into technology and these tech companies and like the space from education, academic in schools to working at tech companies is like, how much of a push do I want to continue to do over and over? And it's not an easy road to take, because on top of, you're learning on the education side or trying to advance your career on the career side, you're constantly going to be doing more work to prove yourself. And it's more of like, is it going to be much easier if I just join? Like, for example, like I'm in tech, but being in the HR space, my teams is primarily a lot of women are in HR because it's a common categorically group of women that take these types of roles. But if I interview candidates and talk to them about like product designers, and one that actually I had spoke with and we became really good friends had told me like, well, when I worked here, my manager was younger than me, doesn't have a family or children, but expects me to work until 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. And if I have to leave early to pick up my child, like there's this bias or disgruntled effect that the team has resentment, and the rest of the team are also young males. So I think like without, for women in this space, like this is where you see like people being weed out. And also like career advancement is difficult as well because of these, what you see in the real world as is versus like ideology in the perfect world, what you would expect of like trying to like, oh yeah, we want to push to have more women and girls in these fields, but is there infrastructure in place to make it sustainable? Is it real to make it something that can really happen? And so in tech companies now, where I've been working in the last 10 years, is like, how do we make it very easy and give incentives to retain our people? And then on top of that, like the most vulnerable population in terms of like from disability, minority, and women, how do you keep folks in the company long term? Because if you're just trying to fill the checkbox of having X percentage of women, but they don't stay, it tells you a lot about the company.
And that's interesting. So Bob, I don't want to, I'm curious now, back to what you talked about access, bringing technology in and hearing these challenges as operators from John and Kat. Is that something that regulators can take a look at and think about, and so that way we can expand and provide access to technology, because there are this whole psychological mindset that's embedded within this whole technology and emerging tech world. You're muted.
Okay.
Here you go.
Sorry about that, man.
That's okay.
Well, I really appreciate John and Kat's interventions. So I'm not hiring, so I can't I can't speak to those dimensions, although I certainly have been in enough cultures and hopefully not created them that other people found hostile or not conducive to their personal or professional growth. That certainly is a real thing. Just to go back to the other two pillars for a moment, one of the things that the Georgia Tech students highlighted, which is, I think, a little bit what John and Kat were alluding to, is, figuring out for regulation, which is, behind the 8 ball for sure. But, one of the key questions is, how do you regulate without stifling innovation? And, and this is the bugaboo of regulation across the board, right? Which is that, that we need to preserve that space, because we haven't solved many of the problems that we have not only need to solve, but have promised to solve. In the context of climate, which Maxine was mentioning, in the context of all the sustainable development goals, right? I mean, we're not where we need to be on pretty much any of them. And so we need more innovation. We need more innovation across the security sector. We need more innovation across all the SDGs, and whatever regulatory frameworks we create have got to be innovation friendly. But they also, I think, need to ask the question, which is, I think, fundamental to regulators, which is something that mothers ask themselves all the time in relationship to their children, which is, okay, what can go wrong here?
A lot.
What can go wrong here? If we go down this path that we as regulators are kind of chasing, rather, we're not out in front of any of it, but we're chasing these, what can go wrong, and what do we do about that? How do we scan that horizon so that we can build, we can, it's like, okay, we make autonomous weapons. What can go wrong here? Well, the answer is lots. And we have hypersonic missiles. What can go wrong here? The answer is lots. And we have dual use technology in space. What can go wrong here? Plenty. And so there's every innovation that we don't want to stifle has downsides that we need to be able to assess. And these are gendered problems. They're not ungendered. They're totally gendered. And so the more women that we can get into that space, asking more difficult questions, seeking assurances, I think it's better. And then on the access side of it, I remember we still have a program, but and it's going okay, primarily because I'm not running it. But we had a program in Cameroon, and we had this school, and we had Dutch partners, and we were able to electrify the school and set up computers, and kids were able to learn during the day. But when they went home, they often went home to houses with no electricity, where it was impossible for them to study, except by candlelight, where it was impossible for them to build on the lessons of school in the home. And so we all came up with this plan to create these packs, which would be the generators would work on them during the school day, and then they would take them home, and there was enough electricity that they had light that they could do their studies on, and that their parents and whoever could clean and do housework and stuff. So it was a real game changer for a lot of these kids. But think about where technology is at this point, like, good for them. And we need 1,000 more instances of technology that is focused on solving problems. In many cases, this was a women-run school that, solving problems that people who are on the cutting edge of technology don't even know exist. At the same token, are the gaps being narrowed through that kind of access? Not necessarily, because the horse is out of the barn, the horse is running at 90 miles an hour. I mean, innovation is proceeding apace. We're now into robotics and God knows whatever else we're into. And what is the relationship between that and a kid that has an electric pack that they can take home and shine light on their school books at the end of the day? I don't know.
It's hard. Yeah. It's a common.
I don't know what the relationship is, but I do know that we tend to lose, we who do regulation tend to lose sight of the innovation problem on the one hand, and the practical engagement of technology in real communities, again, often with gender dimensions, often run by women, we lose sight of the bookends, and the bookends are going like this, and the regulators are sort of in this muddle in the middle, like me, that doesn't understand what John and Kat understand, and doesn't understand completely what's going on in the communities that need some kind of technological input. It's a really, really serious problem.
And it's very frustrating too, if you think about it, right?
And very
Because
frustrating.
some of these kids over there have the genius and the mindset to be very technological and have the be fostered in a way to become leaders in this world, but just they don't have the access to that. So I think to John and Kat, listen to this, how can we ensure that technologies and approaches we develop, considering, what Bob just said, intersecting identities in the lives in the future, just across different contexts, how can we work to address the unique challenges faced by women and children and from these different cultural and economic social backgrounds? I mean, it's a can of worms that you're opening, but what are your thoughts on that as practitioners in this world that we live in?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the can of worms Bob is unpacking is pretty big. And I think there's different layers of complexity depending upon what country and what part of the world you're talking about. So it's tough to dive into that. I know as someone that, employs teams globally, that, we face different types of diversity challenges from one country to another. That are purely cultural. It's far harder for me to find diverse candidates overseas than it is in the United States. And I think it's because of access, as Bob was mentioning, access to critical technologies that one would learn to learn the sorts of things, the core skills that I'm looking for. As I said, I'm looking for more of the qualitative core skills than the quantitative today, because this is an emerging field. So I think legislators, if they could find a way to bring more access, and that's hard to do in regulatory efforts, because sometimes seems like regulations are focused on the wrong things. And it's hard for me to give a specific example, but there are many new pieces of legislation and regulation that my teams have to learn to adjust to. Some of them are for the greater good, and we can see it. And others, we're scratching our heads and wondering whose idea was this? What's the intended outcome? So, I mean, in the corporate world where I live, I think that, there's where Bob lives, it's more about public policy. In the corporate world, we have our internal policies that actually make our company better. Sometimes these policies, level the playing field. So I could share with you a policy at the current company I'm at where, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to come work where I'm at now, is, our CEO from day one, when we spun off of, a much bigger company, stated that, it would be his policy and the company's policy to create gender equality amongst leadership, and they mean it. And so since I've been here, most of my executive leaders have been females that I've reported to, which I can tell you in years past that was unusual, because they would go by those sort of quantitative metrics that were real barriers for very qualified, genius level people to get into these roles. So in the corporate world, we have our own policies that we can effectuate that will level the playing field and create new opportunities and increase diversity and achieve better outcomes. And I think public policy can go the same route if there's more focus on what are the outcomes we're going to achieve with this new regulation and legislation. I think sometimes it's hit and miss, has been my experience in the public sector where Bob would operate.
That's a hard one, Kat. I know you grew up the way you did. So what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I would say like the spin off of the perspective, like the conversation that we're having, we do know like with government regulation and policies, there is a delay and lag because it's such a huge organization over spans of distance to people and time zones. But I think like the checks imbalances that you do see, given the environment that we live in now, people are finding their own ways to ensure that there is like a sense of accountability and transparency. So for example, like, there may not be a regulation on like how corporate world treats, like, for example, like certain types of customers or employees or whatnot, but you have like social media or other avenues to like disclose it or highlight it or bring spotlight to it. So like, for example, like, I don't know, when we had years ago with like the airlines and the way they treated people, like you just go onto Twitter and it can go viral and you have like the masses of people really changing the grassroots and like holding these companies accountable. So I think like while there may not be policy or regulation at a much larger level, setting the standard as a society, in some positive, optimistic viewpoint is that there's hope and sense of people trying to do what they can. And so like, and that kind of ties back to access and women and girls. Like for me, I grew up in a very, in Stockton, California, which is a very high crime, poverty and gang location. But growing up with the internet, which was like dial-up and net zero at that time, like if I wanted to reach out to someone, I can pretty much find them. And as we have changed a lot in technology the last 5-10 years, it's like, if I want to reach out to someone, I can find them on LinkedIn or Twitter and like build that type of network. If I'm interested in learning more about like what's happening in Vietnam, like my home country, I can look for people that live there and just cold reach out and just say like, hey, I'm really interested in this like topic or area. Do you have time to connect with me for about 15-20 minutes? I think like there is space for younger people and women and girls to just empower themselves to like build space for themselves, which is like in emerging technologies, that's really great to have. Whereas previously in the past, like there wasn't transparency or visibility or accountability to know who to go to and where. But now you can like Google things like, okay, I want to figure out ways to bring more funding to my school for certain devices. And if you search it, there probably maybe nonprofits or organizations with grant money willing to do that. And if you reach out to someone and you're like, hey, you're a grant writer, can you help us figure this out? Like high school students can be savvy enough to get that going regardless of regulation being out there or not.
No, that's great. It feels like there's got to be some sort of collaborative effort and partnership that has to happen between the private and the public. Really, really needed, because the public is light years behind and the emerging technologies are light years ahead. So closing that gap is going to be very, very challenging. So, as a practical person, how can we work together? I mean, how do we work together across sectors and disciplines to drive gender equality at work? What is the most effective ways to build partnerships, and in collaborations that can drive real change for women and girls and the others? I think that's a key question, is how do we work together?
I mean, I'd like to highlight, to your point, what you're asking, something Kat just said, where technology and innovation and new breakthroughs are actually an equalizer. And we've seen that over the years. Some of us are old enough to remember before the days when we had internet and you could just get the answer to anything at the tip of your fingers, or learn anything, or learn any language by virtue of having access to the World Wide Web, right? Where, you were required to actually open a book, and who could afford books all the time? Luckily, some of us in the developed world had access to a public library where it costs you pennies to check out any book you wanted to, if you could get on your bicycle and go miles away. So the world has changed, and I think innovation and technology is becoming a leveling force. And I think, but not everybody's living in a country like the United States where you just can get easy access to the internet and a laptop and a computer at school and these kind of things. So I feel like, and there are some efforts in this space, and probably Bob can speak more to this, but I've seen regulatory efforts where we're trying to push access to technology in developing nations. And industry is pushing greater levels of innovation, and sure, usually it's for profit reasons, but those innovations tend to equalize because folks get access to the same information, and the information becomes the power. So, I mean, I think we've all kind of seen that unfold itself in the last 20, 30 years. But
it has. But I think what's challenging, it's interesting for that is that, with Bob's statement about Cameroon earlier, there's certain areas that are not affected and don't have the gap closed. I think that's where the challenge is, right? And I think Kat brought up a really, really interesting point about infrastructure, which is important. Like where is the foundational infrastructure that's needed in order to provide this whole gender equity that we're talking about, especially in the technology field. And so, the collaboration is going to be important. Yes, it's an equalizer, but I guess maybe Kat, you can chime in, or Bob, like where is the dance? How do we dance here?
Well, yeah, how
do we dance?
I think the
Shall we dance?
I think the dance is the right lens. And to John's point, of course I remember a time before the internet. I mean, I remember a time before indoor plumbing, for that matter, but that's another issue. I think that there is a sense in which technology is an equalizer, or can be an equalizer for sure. I mean, I've talked to someone in the countryside in Cote d'Ivoire a number of years ago and asked him what he aspired to, and he had some access to. He had a cell phone with internet access, and his comment to me was, "Well, I want to go work for Citibank," and so, he had already ingested a first world aspiration that was based on a certain kind of technological access. He was also a guy, which is another kind of cultural problem. I think this conversation is really headed in the right direction, because it's trying to integrate hard and soft capacities in terms of how we access technology, how the employment question, what we do with what we know. But I think the technology is also, it's engaged with our privilege. I'm nobody in the grand scheme of things, but I get to do something every day about everything that I'm concerned about, something very concrete. Why? Because I know who to talk to. I know what the levers of power are. I can work with people who make decisions. They don't dismiss me out of hand because, I'm a white guy who's been in the system for 6 million years. And so, I have a lot of privilege that comes with the technology that I'm also privileged to be able to access. And I raise that not to make anyone feel bad, but and again, it is not the job of women to save society. It's like this kind of notion that, well, we need more women because we need to turn the tide on things. Yeah, well, more women will hopefully turn the tide or help turn the tide, but we all have to turn the tide. We've all got things that we need to work on and do better and be more introspective, see a wider picture, all of that stuff, right? That we don't always do very well. And we don't do it at the UN very well either. So, I think technology can be a leveler, but the technology that levels is relative to the technology that's on the cutting edge. Again, it's these vast gaps that separate these things. Will more women in all of these, in all parts of the spectrum, change the game? Maybe, maybe not. Does the game need to change? Yes. Is it women's responsibility to change it? No, I don't think it is. I think it's everybody's responsibility to change it. It's my responsibility to change it, because I have privilege. I'm in a privileged place in the world. mostly undeserved. And so, yeah, it is my job to ensure this access stuff, and to ensure that we can regulate without stifling innovation, and that we're clearer about what we want other people to do or think about without burdening them with a bunch of regulations.
So then I'm going to ask this empowerment then. How do we use technology to empower women and girls to take control of their own lives, or everyone, right? Not just the girls and the women, but everyone to take control of their own lives and their futures. How do we provide them with these tools and resources they need to succeed both in their personal lives and in their careers? We had a question come in. Does WIIS help train women in cybersecurity careers? We don't, but we can provide guidance and mentorship. So if ever needed, please just feel free to reach out. That's the best way to do it. And we can provide you the resources and mentorship necessary to get into that field. So empowerment, Kat, because you have your mic unmuted. And then I'm gonna go back to Bob and then John.
Yeah.
How do we do this?
Yeah, I mean, backing out of what Bob was saying, it's like the responsibility of everybody. But if you're looking at in the infrastructure, like where are the pieces and building blocks that we need in place to make that doable, like to make it possible, right? So from technology, it has to be shared among all stakeholders to step in and step up. How do we elevate each other? So from like the parent side, it's like, how do you take responsibility to inform yourself of the type of technologies there, so that you're raising a younger generation that is going to be socially responsible, but also understand the vulnerabilities of the internet, because as you open information, there is a lot of vulnerability, especially with the younger minds. Then you have like the education system in the schools, like, okay, yes, let's leverage education in schools. But then at the school points, like you have like cyberbullying, and you have like harassment being leveraged with technology as well. So then like for schools to even step up and take reins of like, okay, this is what we're seeing and trending, and this is how we're going to tackle this. And then that information kind of taking on to like, okay, how can tech companies provide support and like build the communities around them with the resources that they have, because in a very like, it's a cycle. It's like by helping the communities around you, you're creating a wider talented workforce to support yourself. And then you have governments and other organizations. So then like providing these like digital literacy education and resources. And so all of these categories and building blocks need to be in place for it to be possible in developing countries or even first world countries. But like on my own experience, like I have family back in Vietnam. It's like they live in the rural South where like now like there's toilets and glass like for windows versus like bars, but then like there's no sewage system or whatnot, but there's Wi-Fi, and like Wi-Fi has been made a priority regardless of what the government or if there's infrastructure in place, because like back then, in order to give money like from us in the US back home, we would have to like go to an agency or a person that we know is flying to the country to give it, that might be in that region, to pass it on to relatives. And now you can just like quickly send money digitally. So I think like because there's a way, people are finding ways to empower themselves to leverage as much as they can. But at the same time, if there are certain building blocks, then you're going to get more of that mass ability. And once it becomes normalized, you're going to get more women and girls very interested in it, and wanting to do it and wanting to pursue it and make it fun, right? Versus like this intimidating process where like men, what you're saying, like you're one of the few females. Like I myself, when I joined a master's program in information security, I was the only female out of a cohort of 45, and it was really intimidating. And then there's roadblocks. The school's like, oh, well, we don't have enough funding. You can either commute 2 hours out and go to the program at the main campus, or you switch majors. And I'm like, okay, too much work. I'm working full time, trying to pay rent. I'm going to go ahead and just like switch to like a different major because it's easier. And it's like, I don't want to work in a place where I'm constantly like battling it out to like make space for myself. But the hope is that when there's enough support structure and like mentorship, that the version of me later on in the future will be like, you know what, I can do this. Like, I can be the only person in the room, which is like, I have a 6-year-old daughter. There is an after school class on Lego building. And she's like, I'm the only girl in this Lego class and I'm the youngest. And she's like, but it's okay. I like Legos and I can do it better. It's like, that is, we're making space for young minds to feel confident and supported and safe, to be able to like promote that.
That's actually interesting. The support structure that needs to be in place. John, I think you in your company, you've done a lot to create that cohesive, supportive structure that empowers women, especially since it's qualitative and not quantitative, right? What you keep talking about, which is important. How can we work together? Like, what do you feel is relevant? How, how do we dance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't like to take any credit for things that we've done at my company
But you
because, as
should.
I mentioned, well, no, look, I happen to work at a company where the CEO had a different kind of a vision, where we have a lot of female executives, and it's easier for me, actually, going back to one of Kat's earlier points, it doesn't look fraternal where I work. Our female engineers come in and they see people that look like them in leadership roles. So it's a little easier where I'm at to recruit qualified female engineers than it was in previous companies where it didn't look that way. I think going back to an earlier question where someone was asking, does WIIS help mentor or train folks for emerging fields like cybersecurity? This is one thing that we've done a lot of where I work now, and even in previous companies. University partnerships are very important, but targeting them in the right way. So there are some universities we work with where we will sponsor their women in STEM sort of groups, and most universities have these, where we will provide them with targeted funding. Some of these universities too are not, your Ivy League schools, where I'm more interested in looking at universities that have co-op type of programs or boot camps, where you can have folks that are, adults with families that are looking to change careers and just learn the basics so that they can shift into something new, maybe something emerging, and just learn enough so that they can get their foot in the door. And I think that's where maybe government can actually help, is funding these sort of things. I know there are some corporations like mine that will donate money to these sort of programs, but these programs require funding. And that funding on the ground really goes a long way to creating opportunities for underserved groups of individuals that usually don't have these opportunities or access to information or experience. That's where the rubber really meets the road. Some regulations, as I was saying early on, are hit and miss. That's where I think they hit, when you get the actual funding in the hands of the folks where it can do the most good, rather than just regulating things where the horse is already out of the barn and running and you're not really doing anything but creating white noise. So these sort of partnerships are very effective and help to, bring in the next generation of engineers and get their, feet wet, so to speak, and get them running into the field, rather than, a lot of well-intended, well-meaning piles of paper that don't really do anything. That's been my experience.
No, that's actually really, really good comment there. So I'm going to bounce it to Bob then, based on John's recommendation about, regulators looking at communities, colleges to help support the funding there to diversify the workforce. In fact, there's a question that came in, have there been specific scenarios where this joint level of allyship that you talked about, Bob, refer to this to help move that needle? Like, is there a way to do that and make it more functional and practical versus trying to chase after something that is pretty much dust at that point?
Yeah, no, I really, really appreciate what Kat and John have contributed. It's been fantastic. Yeah, so a couple of things.
Yes, I know.
We know a couple of things. Sorry. Well, first of all, I think it's important for people. I mean, Barbara may have a different take on this a little bit, but I think it's really important for people in my field to talk often to people who are not in our field. That a lot of what we do doesn't make sense beyond the contours of our organizational mandates and our our sort of immediate connections. And I relish opportunities to do things like go to Georgia Tech, which is a pretty damn good school, and talk to a whole auditorium full of students who are looking for other ways to apply their skills in the world that will make the world better, in addition to improving their own circumstances. And they are comfortable with soft skills, and they are comfortable with the notion that part of this is about learning what you're taught in school, and part of it is about the character formation that probably doesn't get a lot of attention in other contexts. I think that's really impressive. And I've had maybe a dozen interns from that school in particular, but others as well, who have come to New York, who've spent time with me at the UN, who some have been impressed, some of them have been discouraged, some of them have been horrified at the way in which we do our business, but it creates space for dialogue between sectors that aren't in dialogue very often. And that's part of why I appreciate all of you, because you're coming from different places. But here's the thing that most of the interns came to understand that I think is important. And that is that it is very, very difficult to talk about empowerment in the absence of security. However you define security, whether it's personal security, food security. I mean, there are multiple dimensions. Climate change has created all kinds of security implications that we haven't really dealt with, but it's very, very difficult. I mean, you all, I'm sure at some point in your life have been threatened by something, and it's very difficult to move beyond the threat when the threat is imminent. And we have lots of imminent threats now, and people in these communities have lots of imminent threats. They're dealing with insurgencies, they're dealing with food issues, they're dealing with all kinds of, they're dealing with water scarcity. All of that creates conditions of insecurity that make it hard to concentrate on the kind of the empowerment dimensions that we would all like people to concentrate on. And I think one of the things the UN does well is that they understand that things like the internet are both a pathway to progress and another source of threat. Mm-hmm. And I know that on my own feed, I mean, the amount of misogynist crap that I get on my own feed on a daily basis that isn't even directed at me, but it's just horrifying. Yes. And threats against women journalists, threats against women in positions of authority, threats against women who are parliamentarians. Nicola Sturgeon, who's resigning as sort of I guess I don't know what they call her, the Prime Minister of Scotland or whatever. I mean, she hasn't told her story yet, but the amount of threatening jargon that she gets on her feed on a daily basis, and the impact of that on people, and how that changes how they see the world and the possibilities of it. The malicious uses thing is really, really important, because every time we open a portal, somebody breaks in and uses it to abuse, to intimidate, to humiliate, it's a lot.
Well, you just gave me the perfect segue.
So it's not about eliminating the internet. It's about figuring out the dimensions of security that are required in order for most people in the world, not us, because I'm privileged, but that is required for people to get beyond the threat and get into some place where they can actually embrace empowerment, where they can actually put themselves in a position to be hired by people like John and Kat, because they have they've had the time and the space to cultivate those characters.
So you actually just gave me the perfect segue. A question did come into chat. In the cyberspace, misinformation also becomes a currency of power for authoritarian regimes impacting vulnerable communities. So how can cybersecurity companies solve the disruptions to access a fair and responsible, I didn't get to read it yet, responsible technological information and innovations? So Bob, since you talked about it a little bit, I'm going to jump to John. I like putting John on the hot seat. How do you feel companies can do that, to help with the social disruptions, to take power in? It's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of us have seen over the last few years efforts to sort of somehow legislate the white noise and propaganda that gets perpetrated over cyberspace, for example, attacks, these kind of things. But I'm a believer that those things are best mitigated with sunlight and with more technology, not through necessarily legislation, because legislation's too slow to actually combat any of those things. It's usually, technology breakthroughs beget problems sometimes while they're solving problems simultaneously. But then what happens is, if you look at the curve of history as it relates to all sorts of technologies, new breakthroughs come in to mitigate the new problems that the former technologies created, right? And this is kind of the evolution of tech historically. So I'm a believer that we solve these problems by further innovations, typically, and by not trying to put propaganda and false flag type of information into a dark space, into a corner, and trying to force people not to see it, but by shedding light on it. That's the best way, really, in my opinion, to combat these things. But that's my experience anyway. I don't know. Kat, do you have a position?
Yeah, because this is a tough question.
Just to even expose myself, I've worked at Meta previously for about 5 years, and during that time, we experienced Cambridge Analytica. We've also experienced whistleblowers, and during that time internally, I think there are things that you look back in hindsight that were gaps in vulnerabilities with the algorithms that didn't surface. I think the more as groups as a whole or technology companies go through this, it's lessons learned, looking back into history, okay, how do we avoid this type of situation moving forward? And then on the company side, it's because you profited from it, what accountability are you putting in place, and what are you reporting out of what was being exposed, and then what are you doing about it? I think it's important. I think so with legislation, you want to get there is a committee that is put Zuckerberg, Uncle Zuck, to the committees and have conversations about what Meta or Facebook is doing. But at the same time, it's really important to see that as things are happening, we as a group, everyone's learning as you go. So even with these vulnerabilities and everything, it's there's this emerging space right now, right? So as we want more diversities, to get diversity of thought, not just diversity of people, but diversity of thought from all different avenues, to there may be someone at the table one day hey, did everyone ever think of the potential of echo chamber going through feeds of Twitter and Facebook, TikTok's owned by X country, and facial recognition, making yourself look older is a Russian-based app. So I think it's having people to ask these tough questions, and it's really more of getting a diversity of thought and different people at the table to raise those types of concerns, versus having a cookie cutter set of oh yeah, where all the same types of people are working together from the same type of background and developing technology or building these startups with all of their best friends. And so what we're, want to challenge and be able to like, which is caveat to this whole conversation, is like, how do we enable women and girls to like at other countries, developing countries, like to also spearhead, and how do you create a space for like female founders to be successful? But I think there is a need and a want and a desire from people to want to get into this emergent space. And kind of Bob was just talking to like, Min was asking Bob, like, okay, what are you doing? What is the UN? But then you challenge, like for me, would be to challenge everybody. Like John, in your role, like what is Carrier, your company, doing? Barbara, as CuratyWomen, like, is there a program? Is there mentorship with WIIS, with Min and Maxine, like to ask the same? Because there isn't a lack of people interested. It's more of how, where, my circle network of first generation immigrants or like low socioeconomic, or where you're just dealing with like crime and survival, don't even hear this exposure. So how do you reach those types of people? Because like, that's where great minds could be, like your hidden gem, which is for companies, is like that's what you want to find later on, years from now, to build your talent pool.
And I think that's very interesting you say that, because it's very needed to actually diversify people to sit at the table, right? The board seat table. And I think, Bob, you and I were at a table where we challenged back and said, well, you guys all think alike. We don't, because we grew up in a very different type of neighborhood where no one came to us and asked us questions as to what we needed to help us, empower us to get the access that we needed. And I think, Kat, you raised a very, very interesting point about that, is how can companies solve the disruptions? It's really to get the people who need it the most sit at the table and comment on it. We're coming down to the last 10 minutes. So I'm going to—
Can I piggyback on one thing that Kat said?
Sure. Of course, no, you can't.
One thing she said is very important. It's accountability, right?
Yes.
If you're bringing it back to the corporate sector. The challenge, though, is determining what is right or wrong holistically for an entire state, country, world. Does everyone agree that this is the right thing versus that? That's where the big challenge is, right? Holding corporations accountable for flaws that maybe they fielded, it can be a good idea, and can work if we all universally agree with what the outcome should be, which is that's not always happening, right? Typically, especially in the world of today, you have half of the population thinking green and the other half thinking red. So when you have these sort of split focuses, it's what's right and what's wrong. Now, one recent example of what I think folks universally agree with is, and this was recently in the news in the cyberspace where I operate in the US, the national cybersecurity strategy that just got rolled out by the US government. Some folks, and the idea of it is, we're going to start as a nation holding the people building these technologies responsible for cybersecurity vulnerabilities that they have fielded, right? So many people in my field, in the technology provider side, aren't really sure if this is good or bad. But I think it's the right direction personally, because we're the ones building this stuff. And historically, the folks that are responsible for it are the users of the technology, or they're the ones that are getting impacted, not the builders of the technology.
Right.
I think that's one of those spaces where we can universally agree this is the right direction or a good idea, that no one wants to be vulnerable to cyber attacks. But where I'm going is other issues that we try to legislate becomes very hard, because you can't get everyone to agree what's right, what's wrong.
Right.
That's the only thing. But accountability, bringing that back to the big corporate, I think is good generally.
I mean, we do challenge that, like, it would make sense to push governments to do that regulation, right? And set that standard based on the learnings. And so even idealistically, it makes sense, and we would hope that companies are taking accountability for it, but also leveraging government as the check and balance of like, this is our standard. This is what we're going to hold people to, with lawsuits or fines, or connecting it. And so I would
I
like
mean,
to.
it's kind of like GDPR, right? The Global Privacy Act in the EU, where they're finding corporations and holding them accountable for any privacy breach. If you look at that, and the fines are substantial. I mean, Bob, what do you think, especially with the regulations that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with John that the sunlight is the best disinfectant model of sort of dealing with disinformation on the internet. But I also, but again, these are gendered dimensions, and two things. One is that I think that when disinformation leaks into intimidation and harassment, I think it's a different problem, especially for women. Because they are the ones that are often the targets of that. And I don't know that sunlight is necessarily going to be the disinfectant for that. And the second thing is, and I also agree with the tenor of this. I mean, when the UN tries to, quote, regulate, it usually takes the form of a resolution that governments have multiple motivations for signing on to, only one of which is actually doing what the resolution says. And but what comes out of these cyber groups is a set of basically it's a set of norms and expectations, right? It's like, here are the problems, here's what we're not addressing. The expectation is that we are going to work together to address these issues, which is different than coming out with a whole set of laws and in the form of punishments for wrongdoing, et cetera, et cetera. Although I think some of that is necessary as well, because we are now living in a time where any opening some criminal element is more or less happy to fill. I mean, there are people down the road from me in Harlem that stole keys from the mailman and are now opening mailboxes in the middle of the night and stealing all the checks and repurposing the check. I mean, there's no end to the degree to which we're screwing with each other all the time. And I think we need to set higher expectations in general, but also to focus on the security aspects of it, because some people are in the firing line way more than other people are in the firing line. I am not in the firing line.
We'll put you there. Don't
No.
you worry. We got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Left. There's a question that came in from Dr. Patricia Ese Umoru from Nigeria, and about why sponsorship women in cybersecurity. I will have to get back to you on that. If you don't mind just sending me an email, we can get back to you after I've talked to a few folks about that. Thank you very much. That being said, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask one last question, and please, because at the 5 minutes, what's the call to action here? And what do you feel is the call of action that we need to take in order to make this successful and really push that needle and drive it forward? I'll start with Kat.
Loaded question.
I know it is.
The call to action. What I see that would work is more like a multi-pronged approach. You have every angle concurrently working to support women and girls in emerging technologies. And so the responsibility lays to with everyone. So the call of action really is anyone in these spaces that have an interest or passion to it, to initiate where you can divvy or create space or build a niche for yourself to work towards this mission. And so in different spaces. So for me personally, my call of action in having this conversation with everyone, it's trying to see if there is a lack of education and technology exposure in developing countries, and I am in the space I am now, what can I do more? What can I do to elevate others and empower others? And so the call of action, that's where I see it. It's the individual first, because I work more on my individual level.
Thank you. That's great. Bob, and then I'll go to John.
Okay. Well, I think there's several, to Kat's point, it is multi-pronged. I mean, we need better data. We need maybe a more integrated ethical stance in terms of, you know, what can go wrong with the innovations that we put online. I think we need a broader engagement with diverse communities to make sure that technology integrated is fit for purpose and is relevant to context. I mean, and I think that we need I think the UN and places like it need to be clearer about what it is able and not able to do. Because when it talks about regulation, you know, people have a sense of what that means, and it's really not what we mean at the UN. It's not regulation in the sense of law and punishment. So
it should be though. Anyway, John.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the call to action is whatever role you play in the world, get active and actually do something rather than go to social media and post your opinion and thoughts. You can actually get out there where the rubber meets the road and do things. Those are the things that actually change culture and create opportunities for underserved people. Not just going on Facebook or Twitter and ranting, you know. And everybody can play a role in this. Long time ago, I had mentors that I would see how much time they spent actually participating in their areas of responsibility and doing things, and I thought, wow, that's the way. So, you know, everybody can play a role in helping to move this needle and continuous improvement. So you just have to question, what can I do to empower underserved folks in these areas? And there's always something. I think, you know, you can fund something directly, even if you're not involved directly in you know, stream or emerging technology spaces. You could get involved with great organizations like First Robotics, or, you know, you can help mold and shape the minds of young individuals that will be the next wave of the generation that makes all the next breakthroughs that mitigate the problems we're dealing with today. So my call to action is get involved, actually do things.
Thank you. And with that, thank you everybody for participating. I think we've heard a lot from operators and practitioners, experts in their own right here. So please, if there's any questions, feel free to download. If you're on a CSW platform at Whova, please download our bios there. If you do not have a copy of that, please feel free to reach out to anyone. I will have our host send an email out with our contact information and also the attachments and some takeaways that everybody touched on today. And obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us. And with that, thank you very much. Appreciate your time here listening to us. Oops, we have a hand. Patricia. Can we have Patricia answer her? Oops. Hi, Patricia. If you don't mind unmuting and Patricia, you're on the screen. If you don't mind unmuting and also sharing your screen. Oops. She raised her hand. All right. Well, Patricia, if you don't mind, just shoot us an email. I think we just hit the 11:30 mark. Thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to hear from you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah.